They made you feel like the most important person in the world. The attention was extraordinary. The connection felt unlike anything you'd experienced. They seemed to see something in you that nobody else had ever noticed. And then, gradually, without a single moment you can point to as the turning point, you became the least important person in your own life. Confused about your own memory, apologizing for things you didn't do, working harder and harder to recover a feeling that kept moving further away. That is what narcissism does, not through force, through a precisely constructed emotional architecture that begins with extraordinary warmth and ends with you dismantled. Today, we go inside that architecture completely. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD, is a clinical diagnosis defined by 9 criteria in the DSM-5. 5 must be present for a formal diagnosis: a grandiose sense of self-importance, preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, or brilliance, belief in being special and unique, a requirement for excessive admiration, a pervasive sense of entitlement, interpersonally exploitative behavior, lack of empathy, envy of others or belief that others envy them, arrogant, haughty behavior. It affects an estimated 1 to 6% of the population, which, globally, represents hundreds of millions of people. And these numbers only capture diagnosed or diagnosable cases. Subclinical narcissism, people who exhibit significant narcissistic patterns without meeting the full clinical threshold, is dramatically more common. The most critical clinical insight that most descriptions leave out: the grandiosity is not what it appears. Beneath the inflated self-presentation, the entitlement, and the contempt, research consistently documents profound fragility. Psychiatrist James Masterson and decades of object relations research describe NPD as fundamentally a disorder of self-esteem regulation. The narcissist's sense of their own worth is unstable, fragile, and dependent on continuous external confirmation. The grandiosity is a defensive structure. It is maintained at enormous psychological cost to protect a core of deeply internalized shame that the narcissist cannot bear to acknowledge. This is why they cannot tolerate criticism, not stubbornness. The entire defensive structure is at risk of collapse. Not all narcissism presents the same way. Research identifies 3 distinct presentations, and knowing the difference matters enormously for detection. Grandiose narcissism is what most people picture: overtly self-important, attention-commanding, dominant, socially bold. High surface confidence, extroverted, entitled, expects special treatment without question. This type is most immediately visible and easiest to identify once you know what you're looking at. Vulnerable narcissism is far more common, far less recognized, and in many ways far more confusing. It presents as introverted, hypersensitive, chronically feeling underappreciated or misunderstood, prone to shame, social anxiety, and withdrawal when the ego is threatened. Critically, the vulnerable narcissist still has all the core NPD features: entitlement, lack of genuine empathy, exploitative relational patterns. But they are masked by a presentation of fragility and victimhood. The victim presentation generates the protection, care, and attention that the narcissistic ego requires, without the overt dominance display. This type is particularly difficult to identify and particularly confusing in close relationships, because the fragility generates genuine compassion that is then leveraged. Malignant narcissism combines NPD with antisocial traits, aggression, and sadistic features. This presentation can take genuine pleasure in others' suffering. It is considered by many researchers the most dangerous of the three. The most important behavioral pattern to understand in narcissistic relationships is the Idealize-Devalue-Discard cycle. Understanding this pattern at a deep level is one of the most protective things you can know. Phase 1. Idealization. Love bombing. The relationship opens with extraordinary intensity, constant contact, overwhelming affection, deep, apparently genuine interest in everything about you. You are remarkable, special, different from everyone they've known. This is love bombing, and it is the delivery mechanism for manufactured emotional dependency. The brain's dopamine reward system responds to the intense, frequent social reward of the love bombing phase, the way it responds to other addictive stimuli, with neurological priming toward the relationship before you've had time to evaluate whether it's healthy. The function of idealization is specific. The narcissist requires someone on a sufficiently high pedestal to provide the quality of validation their ego demands. You're not being loved for who you are. You are being placed on a pedestal for what your admiration does for their self-concept. Phase 2. Devaluation. The pedestal cracks. Not suddenly, incrementally. A dismissive comment. A comparison that finds you lacking. The warmth becomes conditional, available when you meet their standards, withdrawn when you don't. Your genuine qualities begin to be reframed as flaws. What triggers the shift? Often, simply that no human being can maintain the level of idealization the narcissist requires indefinitely. Reality intrudes. You have needs. You fail occasionally. You exist independently of their narrative of you. Any one of these is sufficient. Phase 3. Discard. When you are no longer providing sufficient supply, or when you begin to see through the dynamic and stop providing it as reliably, the narcissist exits. Often suddenly, often with cruelty that is disproportionate to any real offense, often while already having identified and begun idealizing their next supply source. The discard is designed to maximize destabilization. The message encoded in it: you were never the person in this relationship. You were the resource. Resources get replaced. Phase 4. Hoovering. Many narcissistic relationships don't end at discard. When the replacement supply proves insufficient, or when your moving on triggers their competitive instinct, the narcissist returns. With apparent remorse, with the warmth of the idealization phase reactivated, things will be different. Without genuine, sustained therapeutic intervention, which is extraordinarily rare in NPD, nothing has changed. The cycle will repeat. The concept of narcissistic supply is essential for understanding why narcissistic relationships operate the way they do. Supply refers to the admiration, attention, and validation that narcissists require to maintain their fragile self-regulatory system. It is not metaphorical. It functions with remarkable similarity to substance dependency. Without regular supply, the narcissist's internal equilibrium destabilizes, producing rage, depression, or frantic supply-seeking behavior. Supply comes in two forms: primary supply, direct admiration and validation from close relationships, partners, children, close friends, direct reports. This is high-quality fuel. Secondary supply, status, reputation, public recognition, professional achievement. This maintains a background level but cannot replace primary supply. Understanding the supply framework explains behaviors that otherwise seem irrational. The explosive reaction to a small perceived slight, Supply was cut off. The relentless pursuit after a breakup, a primary supply source, was lost. The constant performance of success on social media, running on secondary supply, topping it up with external recognition. You were never in a relationship with someone seeking genuine connection. You were a supply source. Once you understand that, their behavior, all of it, becomes entirely predictable. The aftermath of a significant narcissistic relationship is one of the most complex recovery processes in clinical psychology, and one of the most consistently underestimated by people who haven't experienced it. Survivors commonly present with a symptom profile that closely resembles complex PTSD, hypervigilance. The nervous system, trained for months or years to monitor for threat signals in the narcissist's behavior, continues scanning after the relationship ends. Ordinary interpersonal friction registers as danger. The threat response activates for stimuli that don't warrant it. Damaged self-trust. The sustained gaslighting component of narcissistic relationships. The consistent reframing of your perceptions as inaccurate, your memories as faulty, your emotional responses as excessive, has damaged the fundamental trust you have in your own judgment. Rebuilding this trust is the central task of recovery. Trauma bonding. The cycle of harm and repair with the same person creates neurochemical attachment that is, in many cases, stronger than bonds formed in stable relationships. The pull to return is neurological. Recognizing it as such, not as love, not as evidence that the relationship was real in the way you thought it was, is essential. Identity erosion. Who were you before this relationship? Many survivors find this genuinely difficult to answer. The devaluation phase systematically dismantled the self-concept that existed at the start. Here is the practical framework from clinical evidence and survivor experience. In the relationship, early detection. The idealization phase is your window. Watch for intensity that is disproportionate to the time you've known each other. Watch for pressure toward exclusivity or commitment that outpaces the actual history of the relationship. Watch for a quality of attention that feels extraordinary specifically because it is perfectly calibrated to what you most want to feel. Genuine connection develops over time through accumulated experience of someone across different circumstances. Anyone urgently manufacturing depth should be held at arm's length until time confirms whether it's real. Exiting. No contact is the clinical standard, not because the person is irredeemable, but because the manipulation dynamic cannot heal while the manipulative relationship continues. Every contact reactivates the trauma bond and provides the narcissist another operational opportunity. Where no contact is impossible. Shared children, professional proximity, gray rock, minimal emotional engagement, minimal personal information shared, no reactivity to provocations. Become as emotionally unrewarding as a gray rock. Narcissists require emotional response as fuel. Deprive them of it. Recovery. Trauma-informed therapy with a clinician who specifically understands narcissistic abuse dynamics. Ask explicitly. Some therapists are themselves charmed by high-functioning narcissistic presentations and may inadvertently reinforce the dynamic. EMDR and somatic approaches have the strongest evidence base for the nervous system dysregulation that narcissistic relationship trauma produces. Talk therapy alone is typically insufficient. Rebuild external connections that were gradually dismantled during the relationship. Most people who were pushed away have been waiting. It is the question that everyone who loves a narcissist eventually confronts. The clinical answer is honest. Change is possible in theory. The conditions required are rarely met in practice. Genuine change in NPD requires authentic acknowledgement of harm caused, not tactical apology, but real recognition that other people's pain matters. Motivation to change that is not primarily about retaining access to someone who is leaving. Willingness to tolerate the profound shame that genuinely confronting the defensive structure produces, and sustain therapeutic work over years, not months, not weeks of good behavior. Each of these conditions is individually rare in NPD. Together, they are genuinely exceptional. The most important reframe. The question is not can they change? It is, are they currently changing demonstrably, consistently, with behavioral evidence over meaningful time? Change is not a promise. It is a pattern. Narcissism is one of the most consequential psychological patterns you will encounter in your relationships, and one of the most important to understand, because it doesn't announce itself. It arrives wearing the face of the most extraordinary connection you've ever felt. The architecture we've covered today, the fragility beneath the grandiosity, the supply dynamic, the cycle, the trauma bond, is your map. With a map, you can navigate. If this video gave you clarity on something you've been living through, share it with someone who needs it.